They say a mafia boss loses everything, only when he loses control. But what if the real destruction doesn't come from enemies, bullets, or betrayal, but from a single, handwritten letter? A man who built an empire on fear and loyalty thought nothing could ever shake him. He commanded cities, silenced rivals, and controlled lives with a single decision. But one night, he walked into a hotel and made a mistake that didn't just cost him trust. It cost him his entire future. When his pregnant wife discovered the truth, she didn't scream. She didn't fight. She disappeared, leaving behind only a letter that would break everything he believed about power, love, and loyalty. And in that silence, the most dangerous question was born. What happens when the man who owns everything realizes he can no longer own the person he loves? This is not just a story about betrayal. It is a story about awakening, about how even the most powerful man in the world can be destroyed, not by violence, but by truth. This channel is about mafia bosses. There are men born to dominate. There are lessons life never teaches you, only bosses understand. This channel does not tell crime stories. It reveals mindset, strength, and the hidden psychology behind real power. The real lesson of this story is simple but brutal. You can control fear, but you can never control love. And once trust is broken, even empires cannot rebuild what was lost. If this story made you think deeper about power, loyalty, and consequence, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share with someone who loves deep stories, and subscribe for more.
Chicago in late winter has a way of swallowing sound, not in a dramatic way, not in the way people imagine a dangerous city to feel. There are no sirens screaming in the distance, no neon-lit chaos bleeding through the night. It is quieter than that, worse than that. It is controlled silence. The kind that makes you realize the world doesn't need to be loud to feel unsteady. And deep beneath one of Chicago's oldest research, where the heating system only works when it feels like it, a woman sat alone among thousands of boxed memories. Her name was Nora Voss, and she was 7 months pregnant, though no one in the building would have known it. Not from her posture, not from her voice, not even from the way she moved through the archive, like she belonged to the shelves more than she belonged to herself. She didn't look like someone carrying life. She looked like someone cataloging it, carefully, quietly, as if anything too emotional might disturb the order of things. Nora worked in the Hargrove Archive Institute, a place built for historians, researchers, and people who believed the past deserved structure. But Nora didn't just organize history. She listened to it. Every file had a rhythm. Every gap in documentation told a story louder than the documents themselves. Missing pages were never accidents, they were decisions. And she had learned, over years of quiet observations, that decisions always meant someone was afraid. That night, she stayed late again. No one asked her to, no one expected her to, but Nora preferred the archive after hours. When the world above ground stopped pretending it understood itself, when footsteps disappeared, when even the fluorescent lights seemed too tired to hum. She stood in aisle 34C, sorting a newly donated collection, boxes of forgotten lives, letters, photographs, old municipal records from a demolished neighborhood on the south side. Routine work, predictable, safe, at least it should have been. But then she found the box. It was unmarked. That alone was unusual. Everything in the archive had a code, a reference, a traceable origin, but this box felt placed, not delivered. Placed, like someone had decided it should exist here, at this exact time, in her exact hands. Nora hesitated for only a moment. Not fear. Recognition. The kind of recognition that does come from memory, but from instinct. She opened it. Inside were standard materials at first. A few brittle photographs, a folded map of Chicago's old industrial districts, some handwritten notes in a language of shorthand she didn't immediately recognize. But then she saw the final item, and everything else in the room stopped mattering. It was another photograph, older than the rest, faded at the edges, but unmistakable. Her husband, standing beside a woman she had never seen before. Close enough to be private, distant enough to be deliberate. The woman was striking in a way that didn't belong in ordinary life. Too composed, too intentional. The kind of beauty that didn't ask for attention, but received it anyway. And her husband, he was looking at her the way Nora had never seen him look at anyone. Not with affection, not with softness, but with calculation. Like a conversation was happening that didn't require words. Nora did not react immediately. She didn't gasp. She didn't drop the photograph. She didn't even sit down. She simply stared. And in that stillness, something shifted inside her, not emotion, not yet, but structure. Like a file being reclassified in real time. Then she placed the photo back into the box, closed it, and returned to her work. Because that was what Nora did when something didn't make sense. She did not break, she organized. Across the aisle, Dennis from Records walked by carrying a stack of folders. He glanced at her, casual as always, too unaware to notice anything had changed. "You still here?" he asked lightly. "We reordering food soon." "You want anything?" Nora didn't look up immediately. She kept aligning a set of documents into perfect chronological order. "No," she said finally. A pause. Then almost politely, "I already ate." Dennis chuckled softly, shaking his head as he walked away. "You always say that like it's a fact, not a meal." When he was gone, Nora stopped moving, just for a second. Her hand rested on the edge of the box again, not touching it, just near it. Like flight alone could explain meaning, but it didn't. Nothing did. And that was the problem. Because Nora had spent her entire life believing that everything had a place. A reason, a pattern, waiting to be read correctly. Her job was not to guess. It was to know. And yet this did not fit. Her husband was not a man who left gaps in understanding. He was not careless. He was not visible in ways he didn't intend. Which meant one of two things. Either the photograph was exactly what it appeared to be, or it was designed to appear that way. That thought should have comforted her. It didn't. Instead, it tightened something in her chest that she carefully ignored. Because Nora had learned long ago that emotion was unreliable. But patterns were not, and patterns right now were screaming. At exactly 9:12 p.m., the archive lights flickered slightly, a minor electrical fluctuation, nothing unusual. But Nora noticed it anyway. She noticed everything. That was her strength. And her curse. Footsteps echoed softly near the entrance of the reading room upstairs. Not many, just one set, measured, unhurried, deliberate. She didn't look up. She already knew someone had entered who didn't belong to the rhythm of the building. The doors at this hour were technically locked. But rules didn't matter much in places like Chicago. Not when someone knew where the blind spots were. The footsteps stopped near aisle 7, close enough that Nora could feel them without seeing them. Then a voice. Calm, unremarkable, almost polite. "You still here later than usual." Nora finally looked up. He was standing at the edge of the archive corridor. Not in shadow, not in light. Somewhere in between. A man who never fully entered a room unless he intended to own part of it. Callum Reyes. She knew his name, of course. Everyone in certain circles did, though no one agreed on what he actually was. Some said he was a broker. Some said he was a strategist. Others avoided saying anything at all, because the truth about men like him was simple. If you could describe them clearly, you were already too close. Nora closed the box in front of her, carefully, like sealing a wound. "I could say the same," she replied. Callum didn't move closer. He didn't need to. Distance was to something he struggled with. It was something he controlled. "I noticed something in your system," he said. A pause. Nora waited. He continued. "Box 7C. It's misfiled. It hasn't been corrected in 3 days." Nora blinked once, slowly. "That's impossible," she said. "Not for you," he replied. "But for someone who moved it intentionally, yes." Silence stretched between them, not awkward, measured. Like both were reading the same document in different languages. "How would you know that?" she asked. Callum finally looked directly at her. Not at her work, not at the shelves, at her. "I notice things that don't belong," he said. "It's not a skill, it's a habit." Something in Nora shifted again, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the kind that arrives before danger becomes visible, before it becomes real. She studied him for a moment longer than necessary, then asked, "Do you always come into archives to correct filing errors?" A faint pause. Almost like he was deciding whether honesty was worth the cost. No, he said. I come here when something important has already started without most people noticing. That sentence should have meant nothing. But it didn't tea. Because Nora understood language like this: indirect language, hidden language. Language that pointed instead of explained. She straightened slightly. What do you want? She asked. Callum didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the box she had just closed. Just once. Not enough for certainty, enough for implication. Then he said, Your father worked for me. The words didn't land like information. They landed like impact. Nora didn't move, but something inside her did. A quiet recalibration, because her father had been dead for 8 months, and nothing about his death had ever made sense. Officially, it had been labeled a robbery gone wrong, unsolved, closed quickly, too quickly. And now a man standing in the middle of her archive was telling her something that didn't fit into any version of that story. You re mistaken, she said calmly. Callum shook his head slightly. No, he replied. I am not. A pause, then saw after. He was careful. The most careful man I've ever known. That last sentence did something worse than shock. It destabilized certainty. Because careful men did not die in random robberies. Careful men disappeared only when someone decided they should. Nora stepped back slightly, just enough to place the box between them without thinking about it. You didn't know him, she said. Callum's expression didn't change. But something behind it did. I knew enough, he said, and what I didn't know is what makes this dangerous. Nora studied him again, this time not as a stranger, but as a variable. A possible connection, a missing piece. You've been here before, she said slowly. Yes, and you've never asked for anything. No, then why now? Callum's gaze didn't leave hers, because something that was supposed to stay buried didn't pause, and then quietly. And now it's looking for someone. The archive around them seemed to shrink. Not physically, but perceptually, as if the walls were listening now. Nora placed one hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding herself. Her other hand instinctively moved just slightly toward her abdomen, a habit she hadn't yet admitted she had. Callum noticed. Of course he did, but he didn't comment. Instead, he said something that changed the temperature of the room entirely. Not safe here anymore. Nora held his gaze, not trusting him, not rejecting him, just measuring. Then she said, evenly, I've never been safe here. A long pause followed. The kind that doesn't belong to conversation anymore. It belongs to decision. Finally, Callum stepped back slightly. Not retreating, not advancing, resetting distance. A controlled withdrawal. I'll come back tomorrow, he said. Nora didn't respond, but she watched him leave, and when the door closed behind him, she stood alone in the archive again, surrounded by 34,000 catalogued memories, and one photograph that no longer felt like an accident. She opened the box again, looked at it one more time, and for the first time that night, she did not see her husband. She saw a question, and questions, she knew, were always the beginning of collapse. Not because they destroy what is known, but because they refuse to let it stay known. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath logic, beneath discipline, beneath everything she had built her life on, a new truth quietly began to form, not yet understood, but already irreversible. The rain in Chicago didn't fall like weather that night. It fell like memory, slow, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Callum Reyes stood alone in the upper floor of the West Loop building that never carried a name, no signage, no public record, just concrete, glass, and the kind of silence that only existed when too many people had learned what happened when they spoke too loudly. From the outside, he looked like a man waiting. From the inside, he was calculating damage. Because earlier that evening, everything had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly like a photograph developing in reverse. A photograph of him, a model, and a woman who was legally still his wife. Elena Reyes was 7 months pregnant, and she had just seen enough. It had started in a private lounge off Rush Street, a place with soft lighting, expensive liquor, and doors that closed too slowly to feel like safety. Callum had not planned to be there long. Meetings like that were always meant to be brief confirmations, not conversations. Vivian Cole was waiting when he arrived. She was a model in the way certain women became symbols before they became people. Her presence filled the room without effort. She didn't speak immediately. She never needed to. She understood the power of silence the way other people understood language. You relate, she said finally, swirling her glass. Callum didn't to sit. I was not delayed. That was how he corrected reality. Not by arguing, Vivian smiled faintly. Same thing in my world. No, he said. In your world, time is flexible. In mine, it is tracked. She studied him for a moment, then leaned back. That sounds lonely. Callum didn't answer. Loneliness was not a category in his life, only utility, only consequence. Then the door behind him opened, and everything changed shape. Elena Reyes did not enter like a woman seeking answers. She entered like a woman who already had them. There was no shouting, no collapse into emotion. That would have been too simple, too expected. Instead, she stood in the doorway, one hand resting instinctively near her stomach, her breathing controlled in a way that suggested she had practiced control for a long time. Her eyes moved first to Vivian, then to Callum. Then she nodded once. That small nod carried something heavier than rage. It carried decision. I didn't believe it, Elena said softly. Not until I saw it. Callum didn't move. Vivian, for the first time that night, looked uncertain. Elena, Callum said diffidently. Not a greeting, not an apology, just acknowledgement. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her on its own slow hinge, as if even the building understood that whatever happened next was not meant for witnesses. I was told, Elena continued, voice steady, that you were careful. A pause. I was told you never mix your worlds. Callum's gaze didn't he shift. You were told correctly, that was the first crack. Because she laughed once quiet, humorless, then explains her. Vivian looked down at her glass. Callum finally turned slightly, not toward Vivian, but toward the space between all three of them, as if positioning mattered more than emotion. This is not what you think it is. Elena's expression tightened, but she didn't raise her voice. That was the most dangerous part of her. She never raised voice. She didn't need volume to create impact. I am 7 months pregnant, she said, and I am standing in a room with my husband and another woman because I thought I misunderstood the kind of man I married. She stepped closer. You don't get to tell me what I think. Silence again. Not empty silence. Loaded silence. The kind that carries consequences forward without permission. Callum exhaled slowly. For most people, that would have been a moment of emotional exposure. For him, it was calculation shifting into a different lane. I did not intend for you to see this, he said. Elena's eyes sharpened. That's your explanation? It is the truth. And the truth is supposed to make me feel better? Callum paused. No. That honesty landed harder than any defense. Vivian finally spoke, voice softer now. I can leave. Elena turned slightly toward her. No, she said. Just that. One word. Firm. Controlled. Final. Then back to Callum. I am not here for her. Callum's expression changed barely, but enough. That meant she was here for something else, and that was always worse. Back at the building, rain pressed against the windows like a second audience. Elena moved deeper into the room. I found something, she said. Callum didn't respond immediately, because now the situation had shifted from personal rupture to structural threat. What did you find? He asked. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded document. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just paper. She placed it on the table between them. I didn't open it until this morning, she said. I thought it was routine financial movement, charity routing, shell accounts, the kind of thing I ignore because I trust you to manage your world. A pause. I was wrong about what I was ignoring. Callum looked at the document but did not touch it. Explain. Elena exhaled slowly, and for the first time, something like exhaustion broke through her control. There are transfers, she said, from accounts tied to your organization, not just money, movement patterns, timing sequences. Her eyes lifted. Someone is laundering information, Callum, not cash, information. That sentence changed the air. Vivian looked up sharply. Callum did not react outwardly, but internally the structure shifted, because information was not just currency in his world. It was control, and someone else was using it without permission. Who gave you this? He asked. Elena shook her head. No, that's not the question. She stepped closer now, close enough that the space between them became personal again, unavoidable. The question is why I had access to it at all. Silence stretched. Then Cal said quietly, because you are my wife. Elena smiled faintly. No, she replied. Because someone wanted me to see it. That was the second twist. Not betrayal. Design. The room felt smaller after that. Vivian slowly set her glass down. I think I should go, she said again, more firmly this next time. Callum did stop her. He didn't look at her. That alone was an answer. The door opened, closed. The sound felt final in a way no conversation had. Now it was only two people, a husband, a wife. A gap widening between them that neither of them had agreed to measure. Elena placed a hand on the table. I didn't come here to accuse you, she said. Callum finally looked at her fully. Then why are you here? That question mattered more than anything else. Because in his world, every visit had purpose. Every silence had function. Every confrontation was design. Lena gazed. Because I don't believe you are careless, she said. A pause. And because I don't believe you are blind. Callum's jaw tightened slightly. She continued, if you were involved with her in a way that compromises your structure, I would already be dead or irrelevant. That was not fear talking. That was understanding. And I'm neither, she added. Which means this is either a distraction or a test. Callum studied her. For the first time that night, he looked less like a boss and more like something rarer, a man forced to evaluate uncertainty. You think someone is using you, he said. I think someone is using all of us, she corrected. Silence again. Then she added quieter, and I think they knew I would come here. Callum turned slightly away, looking out at the rain. Chicago blurred through the glass like an unfinished thought. If this is true, he said finally, then it is larger than what you saw. Elena nodded once. I assumed that. Another pause. Then her voice softened, but only slightly. I'm not asking you to explain everything to me, she said. I am asking you to stop assuming I can handle what your world actually is. That landed differently. Not as accusation. As boundary. Callum looked back at her. You are pregnant, he said. Yes. That changes exposure. It changes responsibility, she corrected. That was the third twist. Not fear. Not anger. Responsibility. For a moment, neither spoke. The room held them in suspension. Then Callum walked to the table and finally touched the document. He read it in silence, long enough for Elena to watch his face shift once not into emotion, but recognition. When he finished, he set it down carefully. This is not internal, he said. Elena nodded. I know. This is coordinated. I know. Callum looked at her again. You should not have been able to access this. Elena met his gaze without blinking. I didn't access it, she said. A pause. I was given it. That was the fourth twist. Not discovery, delivery. Someone had chosen her as a channel. Callum moved now slowly, deliberately toward the window. I need to confirm something, he said. Elena didn't move. You already know, she replied. That stopped him, because she was right. He did know. He just hadn't admitted it yet. He turned slightly. This changes security parameters, he said. I know, she answered. It changes movement patterns. Selena stepped closer. No, she said quietly. It changes yours. That was the moment the power shifted. Not because she took it, because she named it. Callum looked at her for a long time. Then, finally, go home, he said. Elena didn't react immediately. Is that an order? She asked. No, he said. It is a correction that mattered. She studied him. Then nodded once. I left something for you, she said. Callum's gaze sharpened. What? She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, plain, unmarked. She placed it on the table. I wrote it before I came here, she said. In case I was wrong about you. Callum didn't touch it. Elena stepped back. If I'm right, she added, you will understand it after tonight. Then she turned and walked out. No dramatic exit, no collapse. Just a woman choosing structure over chaos while carrying something fragile into an uncertain world. The door closed. Callum stood alone again. Rain continued outside. He looked at the envelope, did not open it, not yet, because men like him did not rush emotional consequences. They contained them, delayed them, controlled them. But as he stood there, something unfamiliar settled in his chest. Not guilt, not fear, recognition of scale. Because now there were three layers, a model, a wife, and a system moving beneath both of them. And somewhere in the middle of it, a letter waiting to be read. The last line of the chapter was not spoken. It was understood. Some truths don't arrive as answers. They arrive as consequences already in motion. Every empire costs once in reality, and once in the moment, someone finally understands how it was built. Callum Reyes did not open the envelope immediately. That was not hesitation. It was discipline. In his world, anything delivered under emotional timing was never just a message. It was a lever, and levers were not pulled until the full weight of what they could move was understood. The envelope sat on his desk like a sealed equation. Plain paper, no markings, no signature, no attempt to disguise intent. That, more than anything, was what made it dangerous. Outside, Chicago continued its winter rhythm, slow traffic, wet glass, distant sirens that never fully resolved into emergencies or routine. The city never revealed its hand. It simply kept dealing cards. Callum finally turned away from the envelope and walked deeper into the office. Not because he was avoiding it, because he was aligning himself before opening it. The map room was not a room in the traditional sense. It was a system, a controlled environment designed for one function to translate scattered intelligence into structure. No decoration, no personal artifacts, just walls that carried layered cartographic displays Chicago at different decades, different power structures, different invisible routes people assumed were random but were actually deliberate. To most observers, it looked like history. To Callum, it looked like behavior over time. He stood in front of the central wall. A city rebuilt in overlapping transparency, 1871 fire grid lines, Prohibition-era tunnels, post-industrial zoning shifts, modern surveillance overlays. Every layer told the same truth. Nothing in Chicago disappeared. It only changed density. And everything that changed density did so because someone wanted it to. Callum placed his hand lightly against the glass. Not sentimental, measuring. Then his phone vibrated. Once. He didn't look at it immediately. Twice, only then did he turn it over. A secured line, no caller ID. But he already knew who it was before he's answered. Report, he said. A pause, then a voice controlled, professional. Nervous in a way it was trying to hide. Someone is moving pieces faster than expected. Callum's gaze remained fixed on the map. Define pieces, financial routes, archive access points, TS secondary nodes tied to Voss historical mappings. That name shifted the room slightly. Voss. Edmund Voss. The man who mapped people instead of geography. Callum didn't respond immediately, because now the structure was confirming what Elena's envelope had implied. This was to an isolated breach. It was activation. Continue monitoring, Callum said finally. A hesitation. Then there's something else. Callum's tone did not change. There usually is. A breath on the other end. We think the wife is no longer a passive variable. That sentence landed differently. Not because it was surprising, because it was incorrect. Elena Reyes is not a variable, Callum said. A pause. Then correction from the other side. Understood. Call ended. Callum placed the phone down slowly, and for the first time that morning his eyes moved to the envelope. He opened it, not carefully, precisely. Inside was a single folded letter. No second page, no attachments. Just ink on paper. He recognized the handwriting before he fully unfolded it. Elena S., but not the version of her that signed documents or spoke in controlled sentences. This was something older, something internal. He read, and the room changed, not physically, structurally. Because written words, when chosen correctly, don't describe reality, they reorganize it. Callum, it began. No title, no affection markers, just as stripped of hierarchy. If you are reading this, then I was correct about at least one thing. I was not being told the full truth. A pause in the writing, not literal. Emotional. I am not writing this because I am afraid of you. That line mattered. Because fear would have been easier to process. I am writing because I understand you. Callum's eyes stayed steady. But something in his posture shifted, subtle recalibration. You believe control prevents collapse. You believe silence prevents damage. You believe protection is something you can calculate. He stopped reading for half a second. Not because he disagreed, because she was accurate. Too accurate. But there is something you never accounted for. Another pause, longer this time. People do not break only from violence. They break from being excluded, from truth they have already built their life around. Callum's hand lowered slightly. The letter continued. I am pregnant. That line did not land like surprise. It landed like weight redistribution, not shock. Recalculation. You already know this physically, but I need you to understand it structurally. A breath. Even in ink, she controlled rhythm. This is no longer just your world. It is shared consequence. Callum exhaled once. Slow, controlled. The map room felt smaller after that sentence, not because space changed, because responsibility expanded. He continued reading. I did not come to your world accidentally. I was pulled into it through systems you built long before I ever met you. That part was important, because it reframed everything. Not intrusion, integration. The woman you were seen with is not the problem. She is a symptom of something already moving. Callum's gaze sharpened, so Elena had seen it too, or had been guided to see it. Either way, she was no longer reacting. She was interpreting. There are things in your structure that you do not see because you are too close to them. That was not criticism. It was limitation theory. Even the most powerful systems have blind zones, especially the most powerful ones. Eyes zones is I am choosing to step back temporarily, not because I am leaving you, but because I need to understand whether I am still inside something I can survive inside. Callum paused again. That sentence introduced a variable he did not like. Distance, not emotional, operational. He folded the letter halfway, then unfolded it again, because stopping was not permitted. Not yet. The final section. If you decide I am a liability, I will accept that decision. That was Elena at her most dangerous, not emotional, logical surrender of control. If you decide I am a threat, I will understand why. A pause. But if you decide I am neither, then you will need to explain to me why I am still being positioned as both. Callum's jaw tightened slightly, because now the letter was no longer personal. It was diagnostic. I am not asking you to protect me from your world anymore. That sentence marked shift. I am asking you to stop pretending I am not already inside it. And then the final line, no flourish, no emotional closure, just structure. Do not come looking for me until you know who placed this information in my hands. Signed only, Elena Callum placed the letter down, slowly, carefully. Then he looked at the map room again, but now he saw something else layered beneath it. Not geography, not intelligence, not control. Interference patterns. Because Elena had not simply discovered something, she had been guided, which meant someone understood proximity rules inside his life. That was not easy. That was not random. That was design. The door behind him opened, not forcefully, professionally. One of his internal analysts stepped in. You've seen it, the man said. Callum didn't turn yes, a pause. We've traced partial origin. The analyst continued. The data stream that Elena Reyes accessed was routed through three non-standard channels. One of them ties back to archival redistribution points linked to Hargrove Institute. That name again. Edmund Voss S. World. Callum finally turned slightly. Confirm origin, he said. We are still isolating full pathway. Callum's voice lowered. Do not isolate. Expand. The analyst hesitated. Sir? Expand everything tied to Voss S mapping structure. Every archive node, every redistributed file, every recipient pattern. A pause. Then understanding. You think this is inside the map itself? Callum's eyes returned to the glass wall of Chicago. I think, he said quietly, someone is reading it in real time. After the analyst left, silence returned. But it was no longer neutral silence. It was activated silence. Callum walked back toward his desk. The envelope was gone now. In its place, only residue of decision. He opened a secure drawer and placed Elena's letter inside. Not locked, contained. There was a difference. Then he stopped, because something was missing. Not data, not confirmation, perspective. He looked back at the map wall again, and for the first time he did not see it as something he controlled. He saw it as something someone else could interpret. And that meant vulnerability. The phone rang again. This time, he answered immediately. A different voice, lower, urgent. Their S's movement in Boston. Callum S. expression didn't change.
Explain. Jake Reyes.
Surveillance flag triggered near campus archive facility. Someone attempted indirect contact through a third-party academic. That detail tightened everything. Not attack. Probe. Callum S. voice dropped. Is he compromised? No, but he was targeted. A pause. Then, redirect all protective assets. Already in motion. But Callum was listening anymore. Because now the structure was complete. Elena had been given information. Jake had been probed. Archive systems were active. And Voss's map was no longer historical. It was operational. When the call ended, Callum stood still for a long moment. Then he did something he rarely did. He made a decision without full data. He reached for his coat, because now there was only one variable that mattered. Not control, not structure, not even truth, but proximity, and Elena Reyes had just removed herself from his reach, which meant someone else had placed her there on purpose. And Callum Reyes did not allow unknown hands to rearrange his world without consequence. Outside, Chicago kept moving. Inside, the map room began to feel less like a control center and more like the edge of something already in motion. Something that had started long before Elena opened the envelope and would not stop simply because Callum now understood it. The most dangerous truths are the ones spoken softly in ordinary rooms. Chicago looked harmless in the morning. That was its oldest trick. Snow had softened the edges of the streets overnight, turning steel and concrete into something almost forgiving. People walked faster in weather like this, as if speed could protect them from whatever they didn't want to think about. Callum Reyes stood in a place that was not designed for decisions. A residential apartment, mid-level security, no tactical advantage. No surveillance architecture worth noting. The kind of place you entered only when you were willing to stop behaving like the person you normally were. This was Elena S. space. Or what remained of it. She was not there. That was the first fact. Everything else would build from it. The living room was arranged in a way that suggested intention without performance. Nothing excessive, nothing decorative for the sake of being seen. A sofa that faced the window instead of the television, a single shelf of books chosen, not collected, a small table near the corner where light naturally gathered in the afternoon. Callum stood still for a moment before moving further inside. He was not looking for evidence, he was looking for absence patterns, because people always left structure behind when they disappeared. Not mess, structure, the way they organized what they could not finish. On the table was a glass of water, half full, no condensation. It had been placed there recently enough to suggest presence, but long enough ago to suggest departure. Next to it, a folded sheet of paper. Not sealed, not hidden, left deliberately. Callum did not touch it immediately. He looked around first. That was instinct, not caution. The room told him something before the letter ever would. Elena had left in control, not in panic. That distinction mattered. He finally picked up the paper. But before reading it, his phone vibrated. Once, he ignored it. Twice, he did move a third time. Only then did he answer. Report. A familiar voice again. Tighter now. Boston confirmed. Secondary access attempt escalated faster than expected. Callum's eyes remained on the paper. Define escalation. Someone tried to bypass academic access protocols and trigger internal archive mapping layers tied to Voss's classification system. That name again. Edmund Voss. Callum's voice lowered. Was Jake compromised? No, but someone knew exactly where to apply pressure without exposure. That sentence mattered more than the answer. Precision targeting. Not chaos, design. Callum ended the call, then opened the letter. It's Aina's handwriting again. Same controlled structure. But the tone had changed. Less explanation, more alignment. Callum, it began. Not a greeting, a continuation. I did not leave because I am afraid of you. A pause in ink again. But this time, not emotional hesitation, structural emphasis. I left because I am learning how your world breathes when you are not in the room. Callum's gaze narrowed slightly. That was not metaphor, that was observation. There are systems operating around me that do not behave like coincidence. He read slower now, not because it was difficult, because it was converging. The information I received was not simply delivered, it was staged. That word changed the temperature. Staged, not leaked, not stolen instructions. I do not believe I am the target. A pause, I believe I am the lens. Callum lowered the page slightly. That was the second layer of realization. Elena was no longer inside the system unknowingly. She was inside it as a function, he continued. Someone is using proximity to you as a method of testing response behavior. Callum exhaled slowly. Now it was formalized. This was not emotional disruption. This was behavioral mapping. Someone was studying him. Through her. Through the structure of his relationships, your world reacts to pressure in predictable ways. I am learning those patterns. That was the most dangerous line so far. Because it confirmed learning. Adaptive intelligence, not static attack. I am not writing this to accuse you. Of course not. Elena never wrote accusation without reason. I am writing because I need you to understand something I now understand. Callum paused. Then read the next line. And the room changed again. Your life is being mapped the way your father mapped others. That sentence did not land like information. It landed like inversion, because Edmund Voss has mapped people, relationships, patterns, power structures hidden inside geography, and now someone was mapping Callum, using the same methodology. He placed the letter down slightly, then continued. I believe the map is not finished. Callum's eyes lifted briefly toward the window. Snow continued falling aside, unbothered, unaware. I believe I am currently inside one of its unfinished sections. That was the third layer. Elena was not outside the system. She was inside a partially rendered zone, a live node, which meant instability, which meant unpredictability, which meant risk. The final section of the letter was shorter, more direct, less explanation, more instruction. Do not search for me through your usual channels. That was expected. If you attempt to locate me through your network, you will find me exactly where I am supposed to be found. That sentence tightened something in Callum's mind. Trap logic. Controlled visibility. I will contact you when I understand whether I am still a participant or already a variable. That distinction mattered. Participant versus variable. Agency versus instrument. Until then, assume nothing about my safety that you cannot verify directly. And then the final line. No emotional closure. No signature flourish. Just structure. If I am part of the map, then I am not lost. I am placed. Elena Callum lowered the letter. Slowly, carefully. Then he stood still for a long time, not thinking, processing, because what she had written was no longer personal rupture. It was system exposure. The living room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because it had been reclassified. It was no longer a private space. It was a data point, a behavioral node, a point of observation. Callum walked toward the window. Outside, people moved through snow like they were unaware they were being measured. He watched them for a moment, then spoke quietly into his secure channel. Full sweep, he said. A pause. Then response. Specify scope. Callum's voice remained calm. Every interaction linked to Elena Reyes from the last 72 hours. Every delivery route. Every access point. Every academic channel. A pause. Then, cross-reference with Voss mapping structure. Silence on the other end. Then acknowledgement. When the call ended, Callum did not move immediately. He stayed by the window, because something inside the structure had shifted again. Not collapse, not breach. Recognition. Someone was not simply attacking him, someone was learning him, and using Elena as the interface. That meant intention. That meant intelligence. That meant patience. He turned back into the room. The glass of water still sat on the table, half full, still untouched. He picked it up not to drink, to observe, then placed it back exactly where it had been. Because even small changes mattered now. Everything mattered. His phone vibrated again. He answered immediately. No report, the voice said. Callum's eyes narrowed. Then why are you calling? A pause. Then, there's something you should see. A file transfer began. Callum opened it. Images. Not of violence, not of confrontation. Maps, layered structures, Chicago overlays, Voss classification markers, and one new element, a red-coded node. Unregistered, unassigned, positioned between known mapping points. Callum stared at it for a long moment, then said quietly, that node didn't exist yesterday. No, the analyst confirmed. It appeared within the last 6 hours. Callum voice lowered, which means it is active. Yes, a pause. Then and it is moving. Callum closed the file, slowly. The room felt smaller again, not because it changed, because the boundaries of what was known had just expanded beyond what was controllable. He looked once more at the empty apartment. Elena had been here, left structure behind, and now was no longer in reach through conventional means. Which meant one thing. She was no longer simply missing. She was positioned, and Callum Reyes had just stepped into a map he did not design. For the first time in 11 years, he was not the one reading the system. He was inside it, and someone was reading him back. You discover the hidden city. You realize you've been walking through it, your entire life without permission to see it. Chicago had a second rhythm, not the one people heard on streets or in traffic or in weather reports. A slower rhythm, older, built under law, under memory, under every system designed to pretend it was not there. Callum Reyes stood in the transition between the Zoo's two cities. Above ground, the world kept pretending. Below it, everything was already moving. The call came without warning. Not because it was urgent. Because urgency was no longer relevant, Callum answered while already moving toward the map room. "Report," he said. A voice responded immediately. "Archive disturbance confirmed." Hargrove Institute flagged irregular access patterns again. This time, it's not internal. Callum didn't slow down. Define not internal. A pause. Then, the access signatures are being routed through academic proxies in Boston, but the origin trace points back to multiple distributed entry nodes, none of them stable. That mattered, because instability meant adaptation, and adaptation meant intelligence. Callum reached the map room door. "It is learning," he said quietly. No one responded immediately. Then, yes. He entered. The map room had changed in subtle ways since the last cycle, not physically. Structurally, new overlays had been added. Red-coded nodes from the previous sweep were now branching into secondary connections. Not random, expanding. Like a system trying to understand its own boundaries by pressing against them. Callum stood in front of the central display, Chicago layered in centuries, and now something else was being drawn across it. A pattern that did not belong to geography, behavioral geometry. He studied it for a long time before speaking. "Show me Elena Reyes." Silence. Then the system complied. A soft projection layered onto the map. Her last known confirmed movements, archive, apartment, missing interval. Callum's gaze tightened slightly. The missing interval was no longer empty. It had been filled. Not with location, with probability. A predictive model. She was being projected forward, not tracked backward. That was new. That was deliberate. The analyst behind him spoke carefully. "She's not being followed in the traditional sense anymore." Callum didn't turn, explain. "They've stopped tracking her position. They're remodeling her decisions." That sentence landed differently because tracking modeling was anticipatory. Callum finally turned. "Who is they?" A pause. "We don't know." That answer was unacceptable, but accurate, which made it worse. He looked back at the map of the second city. Now visible, not as buildings or tunnels or infrastructure, but as relationships. Elena was inside it, not as a target, as a reference point. Callum spoke quietly. "She said she was a lens." The analyst hesitated. "Yes." Callum's voice lowered further. "Then someone is using her to focus me." Silence confirmed it. The phone rang again. This time, Callum didn't hesitate. "Yes." A different voice, lower. Controlled urgency. Boston escalated. Callum closed his eyes briefly. Define escalation, a pause. Jake Reyes was approached directly. That changed everything. Callum's eyes opened immediately. Status, unharmed. But the approach was verbal. Not academic inquiry, not procedural. Callum stepped closer to the map. What was said? Another pause. Then, they told him his father's name was part of something unfinished. Silence, not emotional. Structural. Callum's jaw tightened slightly. Was the source identified? No. But the delivery method matches prior Voss-linked behavioral mapping patterns. Callum exhaled once. Slow, controlled. "Keep him protected," he said. "Already done." Call ended. Callum stood still for a moment, then turned back to the map. Now everything aligned. Elena, Jake, Voss structure, red nodes expanding. This was not disruption, it was activation, and the systems was using proximity pressure to test reaction thresholds. He spoke quietly. "This is T-bout control." The analyst behind him responded carefully. "No, sir." Callum turned slightly. "It's S about response predictability." "Yes." Callum nodded once. That was worse. Because predictable systems could be exploited. He walked to the edge of the room. The glass wall showed Chicago beneath gray sky. People moving, unaware, still inside the illusion of a single city. But Callum was no longer seeing one city. He was seeing layers. And beneath those layers, a pattern forming around Elena Reyes. He spoke quietly. "Find her." A pause. "We are attempting." Callum's voice sharpened. "Not attempting." Silence. Silence. Then, understood. He returned to the central display, zoomed into Boston node cluster. Jake's location stabilized. Safe. But adjacent structures were shifting. Someone had tested him there and learned something. Callum stared at the shifting lines, then spoke quietly. Show me what changed after the contact. The system complied, and what appeared was subtle, too subtle for most analysts, but not for him. A deviation in timing patterns, not aggressive, not forced. Observed response. Someone had triggered Jake not to extract information, but to measure emotional proximity reaction. Callum stepped back slightly. That realization shifted everything again. They were not just mapping Elena. They were mapping him through Elena. The analyst spoke. There's something else. Callum didn't look away from the map. Say it. We traced a secondary signal tied to the original Elena data leak. A pause. It didn't come from Voss infrastructure. Callum's eyes narrowed then. Where? A long hesitation then. It came from within your advisory network. Silence. That was not a breach. That was internal recursion. Callum turned slowly. Name. Another pause. I cannot confirm yet. Callum's voice dropped. You already confirmed enough. The analyst did not respond, because he was right. Callum walked to the desk, opened a secure compartment, pulled out Elena's letter. Read the final line again. If I am part of the map, then I am not lost. I am placed, set it down. He settled, then spoke quietly. She is not missing. The analyst hesitated. Sir Callum turned back toward the map. She is positioned. Silence. Then, and if she is positioned, Callum continued, then she is being used as infrastructure. That word mattered, infrastructure. Not person, not target. System component. The phone rang again. Callum answered immediately. What? Now, a different voice, this time, lower, almost reluctant. Sir, we found something in Hargrove S. archival intake logs. Callum S. gaze sharpened. Explain. A pause. There is a scheduled catalog entry. Froze slightly. What entry? Another pause. Then, Elena Reyes submitted under pre-approval routing. Silence. That was impossible, because she had left. She had exited the system. Callum's voice dropped when, timestamped for processing in 72 hours. Callum stared at the map, and everything shifted again, because that meant one thing. She had not only left, she had left something behind, something substantial, something intentional, something waiting. Callum ended the call without speaking further. The map room felt different again, not smaller, not larger, heavier. He walked slowly toward the central display. Red nodes were now converging, not spreading, converging toward a single point, not Chicago, not Boston, not some institutional structures, but something between it, and realized something simple. The second city was not geography. It was timing. He spoke quietly. Everything is synchronized. The analyst responded carefully. Yes. Callum nodded once, then said, then we are already inside the next phase. Silence confirmed it. He turned off the projection. The map room dimmed. But the pattern remained in his mind. Elena was not lost, not taken, not hidden. She was placed, and placement required authoring, which meant someone had written her position into the system long before she disappeared. Callum stood in silence for a long moment, then said quietly, find the author. And for the first time since this began, the system did not respond immediately, because even it was now learning. The night had no mercy. Rain fell in thin, relentless sheets over the city, washing the neon lights into blurred streaks of red and white, the kind of rain that didn't feel like weather, it felt like judgment. Somewhere high above the skyline, in a glass house that was one simplest control, he stood still, staring at a single envelope on his desk. It had arrived an hour ago. No sender name, no warning, just her handwriting. His wife, the man who once commanded fear across 3 states of underground power structures, loan syndicates, illegal arms routes, political favors wrapped in silence now couldn't move his fingers. He had built an empire on certainty, on control, on the belief that nothing in his world could surprise him in Zanadkar. But that letter was different. He finally opened it. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, her scent, a cruel detail, almost like she had designed it to hurt him more precisely. I saw everything, the letter began. His chest tightened, but he kept reading. I followed you that night because I couldn't ignore the distance between us anymore. I told myself I was being paranoid, that love doesn't think like that. But I saw you walk into that hotel. I saw her with you. The world didn't explode, it collapsed quietly. Images he had buried under layers of justification came back. The model, the private suite, the lie he told himself that it meant nothing. In his world, betrayal was always strategic. Emotional consequences were something other people suffered, not him. But now, his wife's words made it real. I am not writing this for revenge, the letter continued. I am writing this because I need you to understand something before I leave. His eyes paused. Leave. The word didn't feel real. Not in his house. Not in his life. People didn't leave him. They disappeared, they obeyed, they adapted, but they didn't walk away. I am pregnant, she wrote. The sentence didn't land immediately. It hovered, suspended. Like the air itself refused to carry it all the way into meaning. Then it hit. He stumbled back a step, gripping the edge of the desk. For the first time in years, his body reacted before his mind could catch up. Pregnant. His hand trembled, and suddenly, every decision he had made in the last few months rearranged itself into something ugly and irreversible. The letter continued. I found out 2 weeks ago. I was going to tell you. I was waiting for the right moment. I wanted it to be a moment where I could still see the man I married in your eyes. A pause in the ink. A pause in her voice, even though she wasn't there. But I realized something. There is no right moment for someone who is already living a double life. His jaw clenched. She was not wrong. That was the part that hurt the most. I went to the hotel because I wanted to confirm what I already knew in my heart. I did not want rumors. I didn't want lies. I wanted truth, even if it destroyed me. His memory flashed violently. The hallway, the muted laughter, the model's hand on his shoulder, the careless confidence he had worn like armor. He had believed power made him untouchable. He was wrong, because she had seen everything and she hadn't, he screamed. She hadn't, he confronted him. She had simply chosen silence. That was worse. I am leaving tonight, the letter said. I am not telling you where I am going. Not because I want to hurt you, but because I need to protect what is left of me and what is growing inside me. His throat tightened. For the first time in his life, he felt something close to fear, not of rivals, not of betrayal, not of losing money or influence, but of being erased from something pure. There was a final paragraph. And if you are reading this, it means I finally chose myself. I hope one day you understand that love is not loyalty without respect. Love is not ownership. Love is not something you can build an empire around and expect it to survive. I loved you. That was real. I just couldn't survive you anymore. The letter ended, but he didn't move. Rain continued outside, tapping against the glass like impatient fingers. The city still breathed beneath him, unaware that something inside its quiet king had just fractured beyond repair. He finally sat down, not like a ruler, like a man. For the first time, hours passed, though he didn't notice. The phone rang once, twice. It could have been his men, his associates, his carefully constructed empire asking for direction. He didn't answer, because for the first time, he understood something terrifying. The world outside could survive without him, but something inside him could not survive without her. He replayed everything. Not the lies, but the small moments he had ignored. Her silence at dinner, the way she looked at him when he came home late, the questions she stopped asking. He had mistaken her calmness for acceptance. It was not acceptance. It was departure in disguise. At dawn, he finally stood. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar. Not weaker, but stripped. Like someone had taken the mythology off his bones and left only the man behind it. He picked up his coat. For the first time in years, he didn't call anyone for protection, because this wasn't a war anymore. It was consequence. Outside, the city was waking up. Trucks moved. Lights changed. People argued over small things that suddenly felt sacred. He walked through it all like a ghost, trying to remember what being human felt like. He didn't know where she had gone, but he knew where she would not be, anywhere near the man he used to be. And for the first time in his life, the mafia boss understood something no empire had ever taught him. You can rule fear. You can buy silence. You can command loyalty. But you cannot command love. And once it leaves, even power becomes just another kind of emptiness. The letter was still in his hand when he stepped into the rain. And he didn't fold it. He didn't save it. He let it get wet. Because some truths were never meant to stay clean. They were meant to destroy you just enough to rebuild what remains. The rain had stopped, but the city still looked soaked in regret. He stood at the edge of the rooftop helipad, wind, cutting through his coat like a warning. Below him, the city moved as if nothing had changed. Cars still honked, people still rushed, life still insisted on continuing even when his world had quietly collapsed the night before. But he was no longer the same man who had read that letter, not the same king, not the same husband. Something inside him had shifted into a colder, quieter place, the kind of silence that comes right before a storm decides where to strike. He turned to his driver. "Find her," he said simply. The driver hesitated. "Sir, we checked the usual channels. Her phone is off. Her cards haven't been used. No airport scan." "No, I didn't ask what you checked," he interrupted. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "I asked you to find her." The driver nodded quickly and stepped back. Because in his world, there were questions you didn't repeat twice. Inside the car, the world became smaller. He stared out the tinted window as the city passed by in blurred fragments, coffee shops opening, workers gathering, children walking to school, ordinary life. The kind of life he had once believed he could protect her from. Now he wasn't sure if he'd ever protected her from anything at all, only controlled her. There was a difference he was only beginning to understand. His phone vibrated again, a message from one of his men. "We traced the model. She left the city 2 days ago. Foreign passport used. Professional exit. Someone helped her." He read it twice. Someone helped her. That sentence mattered more than the rest, because it meant this wasn't to just escape. It was planning. At his downtown office, the building rose like a monument to his former life. Glass, steel, silence, everything designed to project control. But today, control felt like an insult. His closest advisor was already waiting inside. "You're not going to like what I found," the advisor said carefully. "I already don't tie like anything," he replied. A pause, then a file was placed on the table. Inside were photographs. His wife leaving a clinic, his wife meeting a lawyer. His wife sitting alone at a cafe, staring at nothing for a long time, as if learning how to disappear while still being visible. And finally, a medical report. Pregnancy confirmed. 8 weeks. His hand tightened slightly, but his face did not change, because he had trained himself not to show reaction. That was part of his survival, but something in him still cracked quietly anyway. "She planned this," the advisor said cautiously. "She had help. Legal preparation, financial withdrawal. She didn't just leave emotionally. She left structurally." He leaned back slowly. "Who helped her?" he asked. "We don't know yet." A long silence filled the room. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Was it someone inside?" The advisor didn't answer immediately. That hesitation was enough. Outside, the empire he built began to feel less like power and more like exposure. Because betrayal inside a system like his didn't to just mean emotional damage, it meant vulnerability. And vulnerability in his world was dangerous. Very dangerous. That night, he returned to a place he hadn't visited in years. Not an office, not a meeting room, but the old warehouse district, the place where everything had started. Before the suits, but before the money, before the myth. Rain had returned lightly, as if the sky couldn't decide whether to forgive or punish. He walked alone through the empty corridors of an abandoned storage building. His footsteps echoed in ways that made him think of younger days when decisions were made with fists instead of signatures. When loyalty meant survival, not obligation. He stopped in the center of the space, closed his eyes, and remembered her differently this time, not as the woman who left, but as the woman who stayed too long. "His phone rang," he answered. A voice came through, tense. "Boss, we found something." The model didn't act alone. "There is a pattern. Someone has been moving funds quietly under your name for months." His eyes opened. "Who?" He said, a pause. "Then we think it's your financial director." Silence. Not shock. Calculation. Because betrayal from strangers was expected. Betrayal from trusted hands was not. The next morning, the financial director was brought in. No chaos, no confrontation, just quiet removal. The man tried to speak. I can explain, but explanations didn't matter in a world like his. Only truth mattered, and truth, when delayed, always became punishment. He looked at the man for a long moment, then said almost gently, "Do you know what you took from me?" The man said nothing. "Not money," he continued, "not power." A pause. "My family, that was all." The guards moved in. No more words were needed. But even as the betrayal inside his empire was being cleaned like a stain, his mind was not there. It was with her. Always her. Because unlike business, unlike loyalty, unlike control, she had not betrayed him. She had simply left, and that was something he could not punish. Days passed, then weeks. The search expanded beyond borders. Private planes, offshore accounts, safe houses, but every lead ended the same source nothing. She had become what professionals called a ghost exit, a person erased so cleanly that even pursuit felt pointless. But he refused to accept that, because accepting it meant accepting something worse, that she didn't want to be found. One evening, he sat alone in his office. Again, the city lights stretched endlessly outside the glass. On his desk, isolates her letter still unread again, not because he forgot, but because he couldn't decide if rereading it would destroy him further or finally turn him into something new. He opened it anyway. Read the first must. I saw everything. And this time, he understood something he hadn't before. She wasn't just talking about betrayal, she was talking about truth. He closed the letter slowly, and for the first time since she left, he whispered into the empty room, I didn't lose you because I was powerful. A pause. I lost you because I stopped being human. The city did not answer. It never did. But somewhere inside him, something quietly shifted. Not redemption, not forgiveness, just awareness. And in his was the beginning of either ruin or change. The city had a way of pretending nothing mattered. That was its greatest skill. It could swallow a man's empire one day and still wake up the next morning with coffee steaming on corner tables, newspapers stacked neatly outside stores, and strangers arguing about nothing important in traffic. And yet, for him, everything had changed. Not outside, inside. He stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the skyline bleed into early morning haze. The same city he had once owned in spirit now felt indifferent to him, as if it had already moved on from the idea of his control. Behind him, silence stretched through the apartment. No calls, no meetings, no demands, just absence. The kind that grows louder the longer you listen to it. A report lay open on the glass table behind him. Another dead end. Another erased trail. Another confirmation that the woman he married had not simply left. She had vanished with intention. Not panic. Not confusion. But precision. That detail bothered him more than anything else. Because it meant she had been thinking clearly while he had been blind. His advisor entered quietly. We found something, the advisor said. He didn't speak. There was a financial transfer, small, almost invisible, routed through a shell account tied to one of your old international holdings. A pause. But it was tea for her. That made him turn. What do you mean it wasn't tea for her? The advisor hesitated. It was for a medical trust, anonymous registration, prenatal care, private protection, silence. For the first time in days, something inside him didn't calculate. It froze. She didn't take the money, he said slowly. No, the advisor replied. She built protection with it. That distinction mattered more than anything else so far because it revealed something he hadn't considered. She was running away to escape him. She was running away to protect something from him. He looked back out at the city. The glass reflected his face faintly. A man who had once believed he understood power, now realizing he didn't understand consequences. That night, he went somewhere he had avoided for years, a private clinic on the outskirts of the city. Not officially linked to his name, not publicly known. A place built for secrecy, for discretion, for people who needed truth hidden rather than revealed. The receptionist recognized him immediately. Fear always recognized him to first. Yes, sir? I want records, he said. Which patient? He slid a name forward, no hesitation. The receptionist swallowed. I've not authorized you for now, he said quietly, and that was enough. Inside the records room, silence felt heavier than usual. Folders opened. Screens flickered. Data unfolded like something that had been waiting to be discovered. And there it was. Her file, pregnancy confirmation, stress markers, Dr. S. notes, and one line handwritten at the bottom. Patient requested emergency relocation support. Concern, safety risk from partner S environment. He read it twice, then a third time. Not because he didn't understand, but because he needed to confirm it meant what it clearly meant. She hadn't left because she stopped loving him. She left because she feared what loving him meant. That realization did not arrive like shock. It arrived like weight. Slow, unavoidable. Final, he closed the file, and for a long time he didn't move. Because this was different from betrayal. This was perception, the way she saw him, the way she had begun to see him before she left. Outside, the wind pressed against the building like a warning. Inside, he asked the doctor one question. Did she ask about me? The doctor hesitated. Yes, she said softly, once. A pause. But not to come back. Another pause. To make sure she would never need to. That sentence stayed in the room long after the doctor left. He sat alone with it, because it reframed everything. Not as loss, but as prevention. For the first time, he understood something dangerous. She wasn't hiding from a man who loved her poorly. She was hiding from a system she no longer believed could protect her. And he had built that system. Days later, a new lead arrived. A witness, a hotel employee, a small detail, a memory. She was alone when she checked out, the witness said nervously. There was someone else. A woman, older, professional. She handled everything. Did she mention a name? He asked. No, a pause. But she said something strange. What? The witness swallowed. She said he won tea. Look for what he thinks he owns. That sentence changed something in him. Not emotionally, strategically. Because it meant she had predicted him. Correctly. And built her escape around that prediction. Back at his office, he studied everything again. Patterns, movements, timing. And slowly a structure began to appear beneath the chaos. Not random disappearance, not panic flight, but coordination, assistance, protection network. Someone powerful enough to help her disappear completely. He called his advisor. I want every connection tied to my inner circle checked. The advisor frowned. That could take weeks, Bees. Ask how long. A pause. Do it. But even as his empire began to tighten its internal defenses, something else was happening inside him, something quieter, more dangerous. He was starting to think less like a man looking for his wife, and more like a man trying to understand why she left him without fear of consequences. That night, he returned to the penthouse. The silence greeted him like a familiar enemy. He poured a glass of whiskey, but didn't drink it. Instead, he sat by the window and stared at the city again, and for the first time he allowed himself a thought he had avoided since the beginning. What if she was not lost? What if she was free? The idea unsettled him more than any betrayal ever had, because it meant the story was not about him anymore, not about his loss, not about his control, but about her survival. And somewhere in that realization, a shift began. Not redemption, not forgiveness, but something closer to understanding. And understanding in his world was always the beginning of change or collapse. The message arrived without warning. No name, no signature, just a single encrypted location tag buried inside a channel only a handful of people in his world even knew existed. And that was enough, because in his line of work, nothing anonymous was ever random. It was always intentional, always a door or a trap. He stood in front of the screen for a long time without moving. The coordinates pointed north, far beyond the city, beyond the industrial ring, beyond the reach of most of his organization's routine surveillance routes. A quiet place, a forgotten place, a place where people went when they didn't want to be found by anyone, including him. His advisor spoke carefully behind him. It could be bait. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the coordinates again. The precision mattered, not just the location, but the choice of it. Remote enough to avoid attention, accessible enough to survive, structured enough to suggest planning. This wasn't desperation, it was design. Prepare a vehicle, he said finally. The advisor hesitated. How many men? He paused, then answered without turning. None. That single word changed the atmosphere in the room, because it wasn't strategy. It was something closer to surrender of certainty. The drive took hours. The city disappeared behind them slowly, replaced by long stretches of highway, then rural roads, then stretches of land that looked untouched by ambition. For the first time in a long time, he felt the absence of noise. Not the kind that came from silence, but the kind that came from distance, from removal, from stepping outside of everything he had built. He didn't speak during the drive, not once. Instead, he watched the world change shape outside the window. Billboards faded into empty fields. Glass towers turned into scattered homes. Control turned into uncertainty. And with every mile, something inside him loosened not peace, not relief, but recognition that he was moving farther away from who he had been when she still stood beside him. The car stopped at a narrow road surrounded by trees. The driver looked back. "This is as far as we can go, sir," he nodded, and stepped out. The air was different here, colder, cleaner, less forgiving in its honesty. He walked alone down a dirt path that curved slightly downward toward a small structure barely visible through the trees. A house. Simple, wooden, unremarkable, the kind of place that did not announce itself to the world, the kind of place that did not belong to power. He stopped before reaching it, because he saw her before she saw him. She was standing near a small garden, not dressed like he remembered, not polished, not defined by the world he had once placed her in, just present, real, alive in a way that felt separate from everything he'd ever known about her. One hand rested lightly on her stomach, the other held a watering can. For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them was small, but it felt like an entire lifetime. She looked at him, not surprised, not afraid, not angry, just aware, as if she had already accepted this moment long before it arrived. "You found me," she said quietly. It wasn't a question, it was acknowledgement. He took a step forward, then stopped, because something about her expression told him not to close the distance too quickly. Not physically, not emotionally, not in the way he used to. "I didn't come to take you back," he said. The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth, like something he had never practiced. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "I know." That response unsettled him more than rejection would have, because it confirmed something deeper. She no longer saw him as someone who needed to be resisted, but as someone who no longer held power over her direction. He glanced at the house. "It's safe here?" She followed his gaze. "It's quiet," she corrected. A pause. "Safety is something I stopped measuring in your language." That line landed without hostility. Just truth. The wind moved through the trees softly. Somewhere behind them, birds shifted in the branches. Life continuing, uninterrupted, unconcerned with history. "I read your letter again," he said. She nodded. "I know." Another silence. Then he asked the question he had been avoiding since the beginning. "Was it all because of what you saw?" She shook her head slightly. "No." That answer came quickly, cleanly, without hesitation. "Then what?" he asked. She looked at him for a long time, not judging, not analyzing, just remembering. "I didn't leave because of that night," she said. "I left because that night made everything I already knew impossible to ignore." A pause. "I didn't lose trust in you in a moment. I lost it slowly over time while still loving you." His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, in recognition, because slow truths were harder to deny than sudden ones. "You could have told me," he said quietly. She exhaled. "And then what?" The question hung between them. He didn't answer immediately, because he didn't have a version of himself that could respond honestly without collapsing his own narrative. She continued. "I didn't want to raise a child inside a world where love and fear live in the same room." That sentence was not emotional. It was structural, like a boundary drawn in stone. He looked down for a moment, then back at her. "Is it mine?" he asked. The question came softer than he expected, not demanding, not claiming, just afraid. She placed a hand gently over her stomach. "Yes," she said, then added quieter, "but that does to mean ownership." That word ownership hit differently this time, because he understood now that it was not metaphor. It was the entire philosophy he had built his life around. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The garden moved with the wind. The house remained still. The world outside continued existing without concern for their history. Finally, she said, "You didn't have to fix anything." A pause. "You just have to decide who you are when you're not trying to control everything." He looked at her, really looked, not as a possession lost, not as a consequence of betrayal, but as a person who had made a decision he could not reverse. And for the first time, he didn't feel the urge to chase, only to understand. "I don't know how to be that man," he admitted quietly. She nodded. "I know." A pause. "That's why I left." The words were not cruel, they were final in a different way. Not ending something violently, but releasing it from the expectation that it could return unchanged. He stepped back slightly, not retreating, not surrendering, just acknowledging distance. "I won't interfere," he said. She watched him carefully. "I know," another pause, then almost softer. "But you will exist in his life?" His gaze shifted again toward her stomach, and for the first time, his answer came without strategy. Yes. Not as a boss, not as a king, not as a man trying to reclaim something, but as something simpler, something unbuilt, unarmed, uncertain. She nodded once. Then that's enough for now. When he turned to leave, she didn't stop him, and he didn't look back immediately, not because he was afraid of what he would see, but because he finally understood something he had spent his entire life avoiding. Some doors are not meant to be reopened. Some are meant to be walked past with awareness instead of regret. And as he disappeared down the path, the city he once ruled felt further away than ever, not physically, but in meaning, and for the first time, he was not chasing what he lost. He was learning how to live with what he could never own again. The return was not a victory. It didn't feel like defeat either. It felt like something in between, like walking away from a fire you once controlled, only to realize the smoke still clings to your skin. He left the house in the woods before sunrise. No final words. No promises. Only a silence between them that said more than either of them had spoken in years. And for the first time, he did not try to fill that silence with control. The drive back was different. The road looked the same, but he no longer did. The man who had left the city years ago, as a rising force in the underground world, the man who built empires through fear, loyalty, and precision, was no longer fully intact. Something had been removed. Not violently, but completely. When the city finally returned into view, it did not welcome him. It simply existed. Tall buildings, bright screens, endless motion. A machine that never paused to acknowledge who had once believed he was its center. His advisor was waiting at the penthouse. "You went alone," the advisor said immediately. "It wasn't a question." He nodded. "That was your choice?" "Yes." A pause. The advisor studied him carefully, as if trying to locate the version of him that had left. And he walked past him without answering at first, then stopped near the window. "She is safe," he said finally. The advisor exhaled slightly, as if a tension he hadn't admitted to holding had released. "And the child?" His hand paused on the glass. "Alive," he said. "No pride, no claim, just fact." The advisor hesitated. "Do you intend to know?" He interrupted quietly. That single word ended the question before it fully formed. The room felt larger than before. Or maybe he just felt smaller inside it. He had once believed power made space expand around him. Now he understood something else. Power does not expand life. It only delays consequences. Days passed. Then weeks. The empire did not collapse. It adjusted. That was what systems did. They survived absence by replacing importance with routine. Meetings continued. Deals closed. Names changed. But he noticed something subtle. People spoke more carefully around him now, not out of fear, but uncertainty, because the version of him they understood no longer existed in full alignment. One evening, he received a file. No sender, only a sealed document left on his desk. Inside were updates, medical reports, security confirmations, routine checks. She was still protected, still hidden, still untouched by the world he had once ruled. And in every line, one truth became clearer. She had built a life that did not require his permission to exist. He closed the file slowly, and for a long time he just sat there, not thinking about loss, but about structure, about how easily a life built on dominance can continue without the dominant force present. That realization was not painful. It was humbling in a way he had never prepared for. Later that night, he walked through the city alone. No escort, no driver, no presence announcing him. Just a man moving through streets that did not recognize him in any meaningful way anymore. He passed a cafe where laughter spilled out into the sidewalk. A couple arguing softly outside a store. A child running ahead of a parent. Ordinary life. Uncontrolled life. Life that did not require his approval to function. He stopped at a bridge overlooking the river. The water moved steadily beneath him. Indifferent, unbothered, unaware of empire or collapse. He leaned against the railing and allowed himself something unfamiliar, stillness without calculation. For years, he had believed strength meant holding everything together. But now he understood something different. Strength was not control. It was the ability to remain present when control was gone. His phone vibrated, a message from his advisor. There is a situation in the Southern Division. They are asking for your decision. He stared at it for a moment, then replied, "Handle it without me." A pause, then another message. They want to accept that. He looked out at the river, and for the first time his answer came not from authority but from detachment. They will. He turned off the phone, not in anger, not in rejection, but in recognition that not every structure needed his hand to continue. That night, he returned to the penthouse and did something he had not done in years. He opened a drawer he rarely touched. Inside was a small object, a photo. Not of power, not of business, but of her, before everything fractured, before truth became irreversible, before distance became permanent. He stared at it for a long time, not with regret, but with understanding that time does not move backward to correct decisions. It only moves forward to reveal them. He placed the photo back carefully, not discarded, not hidden, just acknowledged. And for the first time, he asked himself questions that had ever required him to answer. Who am I when I am no longer the center of everything I built? There was no immediate answer, but he no longer feared the absence of one, because absence, he was beginning to realize, was not emptiness. It was space, and space was where something new could eventually exist, or where nothing needed to. Either way, it was no longer his to control. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. Inside, a man who once ruled it learned how to stand still within it, and somewhere far away, beyond reach and beyond ownership, a woman carried a life that did not belong to power but to choice. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
At its core, this story is not about a mafia boss, nor is it about wealth, power, or even betrayal. It is about something far more universal and far more dangerous in real life, the moment a person confuses control with love and possession with connection. The man in this story built his entire identity on authority. In his world, silence meant obedience, fear meant respect, and loyalty was something that could be maintained through influence and power. He believed he understood people because he knew how to command them. But life has a quiet way of exposing the limits of that belief. Because human hearts do not respond to control, they respond to trust, respect, and emotional safety. His wife's departure was not an act of revenge. It was an act of survival. She did not leave because she stopped loving him in a single moment. She left because she slowly realized that love without respect eventually becomes emotional suffocation. And when she discovered betrayal, she did not respond with chaos. She responded with clarity. She chose distance, protection, and truth over attachment. This is where the moral weight of the story becomes clear. Real strength is not the ability to hold someone close. It is the ability to recognize when your presence no longer brings them peace. The mafia boss believed power could repair anything, but power cannot repair emotional damage. It cannot restore broken trust, and it cannot force someone to feel safe again. That is a lesson many people in real life struggle to understand, not just in relationships, but in families, workplaces, and leadership itself. The story also carries a deeper truth about consequences. Every action, even those hidden in secrecy, eventually creates a ripple. The moment he chose deception, he did not just risk losing his relationship, he reshaped how he was seen by the person who trusted him most. And once perception changes, even love begins to fade. But perhaps the most important lesson is transformation. When everything was taken from him, control, certainty, and emotional security, he was forced to confront something he had avoided his entire life: his own humanity. Not the image of power he built, but the person beneath it. This story reminds us that true strength is not dominance, it is awareness. It is the ability to understand that people are not possessions, and love is not a system you control, it is a bond you either nurture or lose. In the end, the greatest downfall is not losing power. It is realizing too late that power was never enough to begin with.